Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. We have a really important, great one today, Terrell. Good to see you, man. How are you?
I'm so happy to be here. An amazing author, a 2-time TEDx speaker, the intermittent fasting guru. I'm so excited to have Cynthia Thurlow on. Absolutely years of clinical experience and now helping people, educating them on intermittent fasting. You're a cardiac nurse practitioner for how many years? Are you
16? No, 16 years. So I'm still licensed. I just choose not to do a lot of prescriptions. I always say I play well with others. So when people need scripts, I send them back to their respective primary care providers and work really well. I always say that I focus on the things that a lot of clinicians aren't able to focus on, and I don't have to write the prescription. So I'm happy. You can imagine in cardiology, that's the bulk of what I did was I wrote tons and tons of scripts every day, both in hospital and in clinic. So yeah, I love everything about the heart. I just feel like I'm able to impact more people now than I was in my previous role. And it's almost 6 years, like April 1st will be 6 years when I took that leap of faith. It's hard to believe.
That's awesome. And her book, guys, it's going to be out probably by the time this comes out. Okay. The IF45 plan. This is, it's absolutely intermittent fasting transformation.
In women specifically, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really important because there's so much misinformation. So a little while ago, you said you're writing this book. I'm like, oh, I can't wait till that comes out. So this is in my patients. My patients will be getting this. Like, here you go. Take a look at this one, right? Go get it. So yeah. So how did you come up with what you're doing and what are you doing different than everyone else?
Well, I think the honest answer was it started as the N of one. As a woman in my early 40s, I hit the wall. I was doing everything wrong. I had a very, as you can well imagine, working in cardiology in the ER and the ICU, very stressful job. I had 2 young kids. I had a husband who was doing a lot of travel. I was probably over exercising, doing the wrong types of exercise as a woman in middle age, and probably not fueling my body enough. And so I hit a wall. I literally woke up one day, was so tired, I could not get out of bed. I started gaining weight. Everything that I had depended on that worked effortlessly in my 20s and 30s no longer worked. And I stumbled upon a book written by a friend of all of ours, Dr. Jason Fung's book, The Complete Guide to Fasting. And it honestly gave me the courage to consider fasting as a strategy. And nearly instantaneously, within several days, up to a week, I felt so much better that it started to become a piece of or strategies that I was using with patients and with my private clients. And then in 2018, I was on a whim. I'm an introvert. I decided I wanted to do something to challenge myself. I said, I want to do a TED Talk. That'll be a scary thing to do, not realizing that was opening the doors to a lot of other things. And so I did my first TED Talk in December of 2018, talking about perimenopause, super sexy topic. And then around the same time, I accepted an opportunity to speak in South Carolina, which is where I was born. I had an opportunity to do a second talk, and I pitched the idea of intermittent fasting because I knew a lot about that. And still at that time, not as many of my colleagues were talking about it. And they asked me to do a focus on women. They said, we always get asked to do talks that really focus on women. Women feel like their own needs aren't being met. And so that was the impetus for doing a talk on women and fasting, not realizing that was going to be a talk that would change everything. And then that led to a lot of opportunities to connect with more people. And then ultimately an introduction was made to a literary agent. And then that opened up another door to write a book proposal. And all the way along, I was creating programs and experimenting with different strategies to see what worked. And it's kind of like throwing spaghetti on the wall, like what sticks. And so from that became the basis for the book. And actually the book proposal was probably the hardest thing I did. Actually writing the book wasn't nearly as arduous because I had been doing this for several years. And so this has become my life's work, not realizing all these years as I was plugging along as a nurse and an NP, that it would come to this point where I have the ability to really encourage and inspire women to live their best life and to really thoughtfully have conversations with their healthcare professionals, doctors just like you, to encourage them to be open-minded to the possibility that this is a strategy that women can do throughout their lifetime, with the caveat of leaning into their physiology, which I think is so critically important.
Yeah, it's critically important. I think, and that's why I think there's so much misunderstanding. Like doctors, really say, "Oh my gosh, it's an eating disorder if you're fasting," and so all these things that we're up against, and hormonal changes, and so I hear it all the time where people say, "Well, I'm female. If I'm menopausal or perimenopausal, I shouldn't be fasting," right? So I'm based on what exactly? So I would love to hear your input on that, of what you've discovered personally and what you're seeing in patients.
Yeah. So I would say first and foremost, women of, their peak fertility years, under the age of 35, have to fast differently than middle-aged women. And I do think in a lot of ways, the playing field gets leveled in perimenopause, the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. All of a sudden, you have to sleep better. You have to focus on sleep. You have to focus on anti-inflammatory nutrition. You have to manage your stress, and you can't. It's not to suggest you can't exercise, because we all need to move our bodies, but it's the right type of exercise. And I find if women really make an effort to dial in on those things, and it's hard, let's be honest, it's easier for me to write a prescription than it is to say to someone, I want you to sleep, 7 to 8 hours a night in a cold, dark room, because if I can't get you to sleep through the night, I can't add fasting. It's that other stressor. And so, really recognizing the women in perimenopause and menopause are at a new time in their lives, where I always identify that if a woman can get through perimenopause without, quote unquote, hitting the wall, it's largely a byproduct of how well she takes care of herself. And I'm not talking about facials and massages. I'm talking about the work, really spending the time focusing in on removing inflammatory foods. We're all on the same page about this. Really looking at our relationships with gluten and dairy and sugar and alcohol, and does it serve us? And really focusing on stress management. And that is not giving lip service to doing 5 minutes of meditation and thinking that's going to balance our autonomic nervous system. And then looking at the exercise piece. We probably all talk to our patients about the rate of sarcopenia after the age of 40, this muscle loss with aging, and how critically important it is to get off the darn, I usually say something stronger, but I'm gonna be respectful of the fact that this is being broadcast to your patron subscribers. Get off the darn cardio machines and go lift some weights. Go out and walk outside. We want to maintain and build lean muscle mass throughout our lifetime. And what I never knew before now was that our peak bone and muscle mass is in our 20s and 30s. It's not in your 40s and 50s. So if you're not making that regular effort, you will also struggle, heading into middle age. So, for me, kind of cracking the code, if you will, is encouraging women to lean into their intuition when they're in a point where they're metabolically flexible, but also identifying, like, being honest and sincere about what no longer serves you. Because I think a lot of us feel we're people pleasers, right? We want to be accommodating. We don't want to say, no, I really don't eat gluten, or no, dairy doesn't really work for me. And no, I'm going to pass on that glass of alcohol. It's really saying, like, what impacts your sleep quality? This is one of the reasons, as an example, for full transparency, I've never been a big drinker, but during the past 2 years, I just haven't had really a need to drink alcohol. And it's the only thing that will give me a hot flash. And so I'm so protective of my sleep that I no longer drink alcohol, and I don't miss it at all, because sleep has become such a big priority. So I don't want anyone who's listening to think or perceive that women cannot be successful with fasting. When we look at the rates of metabolic inflexibility, metabolic disease here in the United States and westernized countries, it has really become a public health threat. And so I think we all have a responsibility to at least encouraging our patients, male and female, to consider eating less frequently, because that can be one of many strategies that can help us, really be able to embrace our health and wellness and not just give it lip service.
What do you say to the people? There's been a book written in the last 5 years that says eat immediately upon waking up, eat, 5 to 7 small meals, every single meal, should have roughly 20 grams of protein, no more, no less. What do you say to that? And eat chocolate if you want it, and everything in moderation. Like, there are literally doctors who other people respect. I certainly don't respect them, that literally say this, right? Yes. So how do we reconcile, the fact that there are some doctors who've written books saying that, and then there are people, and by the way, I've never heard anybody say, that, Yoni Freedhoff has, really helped them, right? I've never heard that, but yet when I hear people say Jason Fung or Cynthia Thurlow, right, helped me, right? They helped me, right? I get these all the time at conferences, DMs, hey, I listened to her on your podcast. Hey, I follow her on Instagram. I saw her TED Talk. She helped me. So help me understand, who's right here? Who should I believe?
Well, I think it goes back to, it's this very reductionistic thinking. If we go back to how people ate before the processed food industry, before refrigeration, if we go back, a couple hundred years, there was food scarcity. And if our bodies didn't have the ability to become fat adapted, we wouldn't have survived. So when I think about the dietary advice and dietary dogma over the last 50, 60 years, and you look at the trends in metabolic disease, what has really changed? We've encouraged people to lean away from healthy fats. We've encouraged people to eat insufficient amounts of protein. We've encouraged our patients to consume heart healthy grains, in air quotes. And what we're really speaking to is blood sugar dysregulation. We're speaking to people that are never at a point for metabolic ability to have sustained energy, to not have cravings, to not be in a position where they go from having high blood sugars to crashing and having low blood sugars. And so we do a tremendous disservice if we don't get back to basics. And basics are really focusing on protein and healthy fats and non-starchy carbohydrates. I think this kind of misnomer that we want to bastardize everything. And the irony is, last night I did a webinar talking about 5 nutrition myths or weight loss myths. And these were some of the things that I was talking about. There is no moderation if you can't mitigate and manage the food. I'll give you an example. I've been gluten-free for 10 years. And for me personally, I don't moderate gluten-free cookies, bread, etc. So I don't eat them. I know that they're out there, but I'm not someone, if I eat one cookie, I eat 10. And so I just don't have them in my diet. So my mindset is always, if you can't moderate, you eliminate. Like that is the saying, that is the methodology with which we work. However, I can eat a piece of dark chocolate and put it away. And so I think for each one of us, it's really being clear about, where we are in time and space. If someone is not metabolically flexible, they can't lean into intuitive eating. They can't moderate. And I think it's critically important that we're understanding the impact of hormonal regulation in our bodies, because if we start from that place, as opposed to calorie counting or just putting people in a bucket, I think it really does us a tremendous disservice. Our bodies are so much more sophisticated than we're willing to give them credit for. And I always use the example of, I think about when I was breastfeeding my youngest child, he was up every 2 hours, and it was like that for 6 to 8 weeks of his first life. And I remember thinking to my husband, I understand why people that don't sleep through the night don't make good food choices, because I'm not craving broccoli. I'm craving cookies. I'm craving candy. I'm craving quick sources of energy. And it goes along with that we have created a nation of people that are no longer metabolically flexible, because we have encouraged them to believe that saturated fat is bad, that meat is bad, that fats are bad, that carbohydrates are what we should focus on. And I would argue that getting back to a more ancestral approach and eating lower carbohydrate or even ketogenic, depending on what is appropriate for each individual, is really the way that our bodies are designed to thrive. I think that on so many levels, when I'm connecting with women in particular, they feel so lost in diet dogma that when we start teaching them the basics, like stop snacking, restructure your macros, like those 2 things alone have such a tremendous impact on how they feel about themselves, their energy levels, their ability to exercise, their ability to sleep. We make it far too complicated. So whoever it is on social media that's putting out some hate for the day, I was actually shamed this morning by someone telling me on Instagram that I was contributing to women having eating disorders. And I said, oh, that's a whole separate issue. But that is not what fasting is. That's not what I embrace. Obviously, that's completely incorrect. Eating less frequently is not an eating disorder.
You know, can we talk about this? Because I think it's an important topic, right? We have, and I know you can probably relate to this. I literally saw a patient today, okay, female, and she's not, you know, she doesn't have severe obesity, very little bit of obesity. I'd say, honestly, normal considering today's standards. And, but I could tell like the psychological impact of weight had, you know, she was bearing a big, you know, psychological burden, right? And I asked her a simple question. I said, if you pulled up your, you know, picture from, you know, right when you started college, what would you say to that woman? And she was like, I would say you're like a stud. Like I could see your abs. You look great, right? I was like, well, what did it feel like back then? She's like, oh my God, I felt like I was the fattest thing I've ever seen. Right? What impact do you think that this idea that women, you know, or maybe not women, maybe just, I think it is women, to be honest with you, more so than men, although that stigma has come onto men. What do you think the impact of weight stigma, right, has made on how people negatively perceive intermittent fasting? Because they think like it comes from a place of deprivation. Do you think that that's where this false perception comes from about intermittent fasting? Do we all see the struggle that people have, the pressure, the shame, the stigma they put on themselves, and think anybody who would restrict must have an eating disorder, right?
Right.
That, you know, am I off in my thinking here?
No, I have to agree with you. And I think for some people that the word fasting alone can be very triggering. I think women do such a disservice to themselves. I know growing up, I had two stepsisters. I was always thin growing up, but they were much more petite than I was. And I went off to college thinking I was fat. I remember this distinctly. And then I was in a sorority and I remember thinking, you know, sometimes they would line people up according to how big your boobs were or how tiny your ass was or butt was. And I recall like thinking, what are we doing to ourselves? This comparisonitis about what is normal behavior. But I do find that the biggest people that will comment on fasting as being a form of restrictive behavior are people that really don't understand what fasting represents. You are choosing to eat within a certain time period. You are not choosing not to eat. That's an important distinction. And a lot of people that work with eating disorder patients are they themselves recovering bulimics, anorexic, binge eaters. And I have great reverence and respect for people who are interested in working with a specific population of patients, but I think they're so attuned to the concept of restrictive behaviors or shameful behaviors that people do behind closed doors that, to me, I always have to use the caveat of, you know, understanding that maybe this, I don't, not to take it personally because this person has their own experience. And so their own experience has kind of guided their perception of what this word represents. And that's why I've gotten into the habit of saying, eating less often. That doesn't mean you're not eating, but the word fasting in and of itself for a lot of people can be very triggering. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, you know, the social media world that we live in is really powerful, you know, especially for, you know, I think I have all boys, so obviously it's not as much of an issue for me, although I do acknowledge that, you know, teens and young adults that are growing up in this culture where everything is filtered and looks very sanitized and everything looks perfect. The reality is life is messy and life is not perfect. And so the sooner we can have those honest conversations with our patients and acknowledge what it is that they're going through. I see for a lot of women, they're fixated on a scale number. Maybe it's the weight they were when they were 18 years old, which isn't realistic. I don't want to weigh what I weighed at 18. I was like, I laugh about it now. I was way too skinny. Even with all those other factors, I was, you know, kind of wrestling around in my head with. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that fixation on the scale starts at an early age for a lot of people. especially for women. There's a lot of comparisonitis. It even was problematic when my kids were little and we would go to preschool and all the moms felt like they had to be so dressed up and looked perfect. And oh my gosh, look how thin she looks. It was almost like a badge of honor. And I always say, you know, missing out on your life because you're fixated on food is no way to live. So I think it's important for us to kind of be sensitive to these things, but also to acknowledge that people behind the scenes can wrestle with a whole lot. And sometimes the word itself, fasting, can be problematic.
You know, can I add to that? So I went back. I was like, I've seen people come after you for being such a proponent of fasting and saying you're going to cause an eating disorder. I've seen it on social media. So I went to the literature.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to literature. I looked up all the large clinical trials with alternate day fasting, intermittent fasting. Do you know how many of those trials reported an eating disorder as a side effect?
Yeah,
Zero.
exactly. Zero.
So, you know, so I find this thing, little, you know, calling it into question, this common, you know, complaint that's come towards you, towards Jason Fung and some other proponents, you know, ourselves. I don't think there's any good evidence to say that fasting causes an eating disorder. I think it's the other way around. The eating disorder leads people, you know, that bad relationship to food, the psychology of weight and weight stigma and those pressures you talked about, right, to lead them to restrict rather than understand what they're dealing with. And what your book does so well is help people understand what it is you're dealing with, the hormones, the, you know, how to eat even, right? You really spell out to people, you know, nutrition towards the end of the book. So I think that was it was nice to see that sort of approach. You know, it's a great, you know, it's a plug for your book here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I think it's one of those things that when I always say it's my spidey sense, I think we all have it as clinicians. There are sometimes people that are just not in a position to be able to fast. And, you know, have I had patients that have had a history of anorexia or bulimia or binge eating successfully go on to do intermittent fasting? Absolutely. But they're usually in recovery. They're working with a therapist. And that's something that I feel like is critically important to note, that there are specialists out there that can help support them emotionally through that process. But it's certainly reassuring to know that the research does not support that there's this interrelationship. I mean, I definitely see people that fast too long and then, you know, the amygdala overrides their prefrontal cortex and suddenly they want to eat everything and anything. And so I would say, let's back up the bus. Don't push that fast to 20 hours. Maybe you need to be happy with 16 and just celebrate right where you are. But it's that comparisonitis, even with fasting windows, that I find utterly fascinating. But kind of reminding people that, you know, you trigger that primitive brain, that reptile brain in your body. You may make some not so great choices. I'm not sure if you both see that with your patients, but that's always kind of a humorous thing. I just say it's usually when someone's trying to push too quickly or, you know, hasn't properly fueled their body the day before. So their body is hungry. And I would say, kind of, if you're hungry, break your fast. Don't, you know, you're not going to win an award for fasting an extra 30 minutes when your body really needs to be refueled. And I don't believe that we should leave our bodies in a state of denial. Like if we need that piece of chicken or we need that, you know, piece of steak, or we need to have that vegetable, like eat it. Like that's not the way to live in a life of deprivation. And certainly none of us, I perceive, you know, live that way. We definitely enjoy good nutrient dense food and enjoy our lives with our families and friends.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think that is a huge topic, that some people will fast all day, then they're starving and they just go ravenous and eat everything at night, right?
Mm-hmm.
For 5 hours. So then you say, okay, maybe you add a little something earlier in the day, break that fast, listen to your body. Jason Fung talks about the same thing. I don't think anyone's radical in their views. And I think when we look at it, I think really what's interesting is the misperception that when people fast, it's all about calories, that you're taking in less calories. So people will fast one day, then they eat two tiny things the next day, then they try fasting again, and then their body is always in a, you know, instead of this feasting and fasting or eating more on the days when you're eating, if you're doing alternate day fasting, for instance. But it's really the effect on the hormones. And the crazy thing I've been reading lately is the effect of the hormones, like stress hormones, on the gut microbiome, and with satiety signaling and dopamine response to food and all these. It's really, really a fascinating area where it's a bigger picture than calories in, calories out.
Absolutely. Well, and that was like the first thing I led with last night in this webinar that I did for people that had done had purchased the book prior to publication date, and trying to explain in a very succinct way why the concept of, I just have to go work out harder because I ate, I ate this indulgent meal. And I was like, first of all, give yourself grace, let it go back to your normal, kind of methodology the next day. We should not be punishing our bodies. We should not be thinking that we're going to out exercise choices that we make. We need to just acknowledge it, process it, move on. And I think in a lot of ways, and I know, Tro, you have definitely, you've definitely, Lane is the gentleman who, wants to die on the hill about calories in and CICO. And I know you had a great podcast that both my husband and I listened to, where you guys had this incredible discussion, were respectful and had this great discussion. But the concept of like thermic effect of food and like this energy balance hypothesis, it's so reductionistic. Like for me, it's like everything wants to put everything in a box. Like, here's the box and this is all you need to do. If you eat 1,200 calories, extra calories, all you need to do is go, run 20 miles and it's going to completely find this balance. Our bodies are far more sophisticated than that. And I think on a lot of levels, it's that calorie perspective. I always tell people, like, our bodies are so much more sophisticated. Calorie is just a unit of measurement. And on so many levels, it's all about like fueling our bodies in a way that helps balance insulin and cortisol, balance things so that we have, a better managed blood sugar response. I wear a continuous glucose monitor kind of intermittently. And that's been insightful even for me. Like I was telling someone the other day, like, I love plantains. Plantains do not love me. Even though I eat like a starchy carb, 1 or 2 days a week to kind of push myself out of ketosis. What I find fascinating is it doesn't matter how I prepare those plantains, I get the same blood sugar response and it's not good. And so bioindividuality rules, really leaning into what works for you rules, and not I think, let me back up what I'm about to say. We are designed as human beings to evolve, shift, and change. As clinicians, it is critically important that we remain non-dogmatic, because all of us trained at a time when the calories in, calories out model was perpetuated. There's a lot of things, we were also told grains are super healthy and saturated fat is bad, and a whole slew of other things that we now know are complete misconceptions. But I think it's so important for us as clinicians to kind of say, now that I understand more about the gut microbiome and butyrate and the impact of stress on the gut microbiome and all these other factors, like maybe what I learned 20 years ago is no longer really applicable. Like now I have to think differently and thoughtfully. And I think one of the really cool things about, being a podcaster, and certainly your podcast being a great example of this, is that you get to like pick the brains of all these incredible humans that are doing amazing work to change the narrative, and to be able to share it with people so we can always be learning. Like my mom was just here because my husband was on a business trip, and I was trying to encourage my 76-year-old mother to listen to podcasts. And she was like, I'm very busy. I was like, Mom, you're retired. You could be learning every day, learning something from someone every day. And so it's the same way. Like we should always be learning. I think that's something that in a lot of ways is lost in our environment, which I think is really sad. People get like very dogmatic, and there's so much cognitive dissonance that they're not willing to entertain the possibility that what they learned in school is wrong.
I think one of the things to tackle that is you can see that play out, right? As more and more people are powered with their own information, their own Oura Ring, their own Whoop, their own, CGM. As they're empowered with their own information, they no longer have to rely on those really biased people who are generating the epidemiologic data that drives all the nutrition dogma, right? So it's not what everybody thinks is good for me. It's not the central planners and what they think it's good for me. It's actually how, what does my body say? How is my sleep? How is my blood sugar, right? And as medicine, right, becomes more and more accessible to people, telemedicine, right? Now we can deliver more immediate feedback to people. Here's your lipid level. Here's your blood glucose average, right? And so now you have this immediate feedback loop, and you can learn rather than wait 20 years to become obese and then think.
And Troy, you can learn on the fly. For instance, one of my patients, he had biscuits and gravy and some potatoes, and on his CGM, he said, "This is what I ate." You see sugar go from 70 to 256 and back then. He goes like, "Oh crap, I'm never doing that again." Holy cow. Like he saw it right away, like instantly he saw it and goes, "Okay, that's not good for me." Then the next day he had bacon and eggs and some avocado, flat, totally normal sugars. He's like, "Oh my gosh." So you don't need my opinion. You can look at it. And I really truly believe that some of these diet specialists out there who hate the CGM, that's why, because like you eat their diet and you see what your sugars, these sugar excursions cause problems. So, with hormonally and all that. So gosh, if you're not eating, it's going to be better. If you're fasting, it's going to be a lot better than having sugar excursions up and down all day long from a hormonal standpoint.
Yep. Well, I this is where I had my most vicious attack on social media yet was, I think I reached out to Brian and was like, help, how would you handle this? I think I reached out to both of you, but it was really just more for moral support. But I was talking about people that are metabolically healthy having CGMs, and this individual like went after me, and we started having this kind of tussle back and forth. And I was like, you are perpetuating antiquated. She's like, I'm a blah, 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 throwing out all her academic accolades. And I was like, you're wrong. And you're totally wrong. And you're putting people's lives at risk by not encouraging them to take inspired action and to be able to be a partner in their healthcare. Like to your point, Brian, how empowering is it when a patient can come to you and make that association of saying, this is the meal I had, this is what happened, this is the net impact of my blood sugar. I now know I don't want to eat that again. I should not eat that again. As opposed to just kind of bumbling along, which is what typically happens. We wait until someone has diabetes and then all of a sudden we put them on medicine that is just going to perpetuate and exacerbate a lot of their metabolic health issues. I mean, that to me is just so unfortunate. I have one of my best friends from childhood. I've talked to her about this for years, about her being insulin resistant. And she finally, got to the point where she asked for a CGM. She did all these things. I said, go for a walk for 10 minutes after eating your dinner every night. I want you to do some body weight, strength training exercises. She's like, I hate you, but I love you. But she said, it's working. And so she said, why wasn't I being told to do these things 10 years ago? And I said, I can't answer that. But right now we're looking forward. But there's so many things that are within our patient's control. We just have to allow them an opportunity to utilize the technology that we have out there now. And it could be like really low tech, like get out in nature for 10 minutes every morning and go for a walk after your dinner. I used to make fun of this couple that would have these evening walks in my neighborhood. And I would say to my husband, now we are those people, like, now we're that middle-aged couple that does that with our dogs. But it really is a great way to, kind of bump up insulin sensitivity. And why aren't we talking about these things?
Yeah, it's so much out there, and just making little changes like that. Like, I have a guy who lost a bunch of weight because he would just go for a walk. When he got home from work, when he was stressed, he'd walk around the neighborhood. He said he'd even break a sweat. He would talk to his neighbors, see how the gardening's going, just BS with people come back. But he said in that time, he would have had 2 glasses of wine. He would have had chips and crackers and waited for dinner while he's talking to his wife. So he just comes home, him and his wife have dinner, and then they go for a walk together after, and he's doing great. He's not making it's not like he's working out 4 hours a day. So he's just figuring out what works for him and his family, and so just fitting it into the lifestyle is critical. And the other thing that comes up when we talk about control and binge eating and all this kind of stuff, and I think a lot of times the binge eating and the poor choices come when people are just out of control. People say, I just can't control it. So when they do say, yeah, I can, like, and the natural progression, Tro and I have talked about it a lot in the podcast, is people will come in and say, don't talk to me about fasting. I'm not going to try it. No problem. And then a week or two in, they say, oh, I skipped lunch yesterday. Oh, really? How was that? I didn't have breakfast. Oh, I wasn't even hungry, so I didn't eat. And so it's no big deal. They weren't even, if they knew they had to fast all day, they might be stressed out. But when they go, yeah, I wasn't hungry at lunch, so I just skipped in and waited till I got home and I was fine. And when they realize they don't die, the next time they realize, oh, maybe I could have dinner a little earlier. I could change my food plan. And so just those small changes and not making it so dramatic.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that I think people get caught up in, and I think you addressed it, is, if you notice, most people, right, to make fasting easier, there has to be some component of moderating the carbohydrate. But they go really, hand in hand. And the degree which somebody has to moderate those carbohydrates really depends on a number of factors. But it's individual, right? Like you just said, hey, you can enjoy a little bit of carbohydrate twice a week and you're fine. And Other people who are more insulin resistant like me, I have to restrict my carbohydrates a lot more. And I think that that's the benefit of fasting is, one, you can do it without changing your dietary habits at all, right? Meaning you can just start by restricting time. And then the other side of it is as well, hey, what's the diet that will work best with this, right? I mean, it's very clearly, a low carb approach, in my opinion. Do you get people who are very reluctant to kind of lower their carbs as they adopt intermittent fasting?
Oh, yes. And I think the most challenging group of all are the vegetarians. And I always remind people that, whether it's for moral, ethical reasons, I want to be respectful of that, but it's very hard to be low carb-ish and be vegetarian and get enough protein in. And that's, I feel like women in particular don't eat enough protein, and we start to talk about the sarcopenia and all these other things that can be hugely problematic. And that's where I sometimes feel like I'm at a disadvantage, because it's much easier for me to say to someone, eat some steak, eat some chicken, eat a piece of fish, etc. It's much harder to say to someone, okay, well, you're getting your protein sources from plant-based sources, which tend to innately be higher in carbohydrate. And there's no way for things to be equivalent. Like animal-based protein will be superior to plant-based protein. And so that is where I sometimes get stuck, because my kind of methodology is for women in particular, especially as we are aging and as we're losing some degree of estradiol, we're losing insulin sensitivity, and explaining that this really can be problematic on a lot of different levels. So that's where I sometimes feel like that's where I butt up against some challenges. Like my team and I have had to create lots of plant-based resources because we really struggle with finding balance between protein and carbs, in particular for a lot of these women. And many of these women are insulin resistant, they're metabolically inflexible. And so it really rocks their world when all of a sudden I'm like, will you eat some eggs? Like I try to find, like, where can I go? Would you eat some eggs or maybe some fish? Like that would make me happy. I feel like you'd at least be getting something that's a little bit more nutrient dense. And that's where I struggle more often than not. That's kind of the challenging point when I explain what is happening physiologically as we age. And certainly there are also, and this is a tangential topic, but it's certainly relevant, there's still a lot of fear about hormone replacement therapy, whether it's estradiol, testosterone, progesterone. There's so much fear that I have women who, quote unquote, bear back at all through menopause, and their bodies clearly need some hormonal support, but they're fearful to even start. But I try to just continue to educate, like, okay, well, let's not start with hormones. We need to start on the lifestyle piece first. And then the last option, in my estimation, is the hormone piece, meaning we do all the lifestyle pieces first. And then if you still need it, then that can certainly be an opportunity to help support your body. But I think there's just there's a lot to unpack about the physiology piece. And certainly vegetarians getting enough protein can be a challenge for sure.
And that's the challenge. That's the challenge.
I got two things written down here that I wanted to go, but go ahead, Brian.
No, I think that's the challenge. That's the challenge for me too. When I have someone who's they don't like meat, they don't like eggs. It's like, oh my gosh, okay, let's try to figure this out. What works for you? And it's hard to find good choices. But intermittent fasting, I think, it does help with that, because you're going to spread those carbs out, a little bit better, and you're probably going to be able to get hormonally better. Because I think one of the big things that's really been overlooked with fasting, time restricted eating, is the change in the gut microbiome. Mm-hmm. That is a huge deal with satiety. It's a huge deal with mood and hormones. And, having some stability is definitely helpful for us. And we do better in those situations. Now, stress, and the other interesting thing about stress, acute stress, like working out or sauna, you get a really calming effect after that effect. So when you look at the overall effect of releasing, what am I blanking on, Tro? Nitric oxide, and dilating blood vessels and decreasing the shearing force, and the effect on blood pressure and stress hormones. It's really amazing that those acute stress, like cold water immersion. I'm reading about that, and then you get this acute stress, and then your body calms it all down, and then it's the long-term chronic stress that's a big problem.
Correct. And I think that's an important differentiator. If we're talking about hormesis or hormetic stress, I always like to say comfort is a cage. we don't realize it or not, but our bodies need to be challenged. I always say, like, I have two very smart dogs, and I can tell when they haven't had enough challenges because they tend to go and do specific things in the house. Like they'll pull trash out of the trash can and string it everywhere, all over the place. But our bodies need to be stressed. That's why high intensity interval training, cold therapies, whether it's, you take a cold shower, you do cryotherapy, infrared sauna, etc. Fasting is designed, it's the right amount of stress at the right time in the right amount that is designed to make us stronger and more resilient. We are not designed to be comfortable. Comfort is a cage. This is kind of like one of my canned phrases, because I think it's really helpful for people to understand that if you do the same thing every day, every single day, 7 days a week, you're not growing as a human being. There's this adaptation piece that can be hugely problematic. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize and understand that a little bit of fasting is going to be helpful. A little bit of strength training is going to be helpful. A little bit of 30 seconds of a cold shower is going to be helpful. Yes, it stresses the body like at that moment, but then the counter regulatory mechanisms that step in really can be hugely helpful. And so I love that you brought that up. But yeah, hormesis is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Well, and it's important, the labradoodle aspect. I have one that gets in the garbage cans too.
Oh,
so as those short stress, super stressful, then you'd be nice. They're so nice, but they get in the dang garbage. What's wrong with these dogs?
I know.
So we have covered garbage cans everywhere now.
You're smart. Unfortunately, we have teenage boys, and teenage boys are not good about dumping their trash cans. And therefore, one labradoodle, or golden doodle in particular, likes to strewn like whatever's in the trash. It's like literally he lines it up. He just takes it out, lines it up. And I just kind of look at my kids. I'm like, seriously? They're teenagers. To them, it's an inconvenience to, bring their dishes downstairs or pick up after themselves. So it's like a chronic habitual. I'm like, I'm just going to close your door for my sanity.
So Troy, you have a lineup of questions. I know your brain's working.
I got three questions now. So you talked about vegetarians and having this desire to get them some choline and protein and healthy fats, through eggs and fish. What percentage of vegetarians that come to you or you've had some work with, what percentage would you say are ethical, and what percentage are just have been taught to eat that way for whatever reason, whether it's educational? How many of them strongly feel about animals, and how many were taught to eat that way?
I would guess 90% of them were taught to eat that way, and maybe 10%.
So 90% have an eating disorder, right? Where they're purposely excluding a food group because they for whatever reason, right?
Yeah, the plant-based narrative, which I know we're all very aligned on this. And I was actually saying to my husband, I have to be careful, especially given the fact I have a book coming out that, normally my go-to when I get frustrated is I'll go to Twitter and I'll bang out a tweet. And then, I kind of watch the response. But I think on a lot of levels that, and this is why I always say, like, I respect people's choices, but I think if these individuals really understood, if they really understood what those nutritional choices are doing to their health. I always use my mom as an example. She was vegan for 5 or 6 years. And honest to goodness, I think it has taken her probably 10 years to undo the impact it made on her health. And she'll be the first person to tell you that now. Like, she proudly now eats pork and beef, she eats everything. But I think that for a lot of people, they don't recognize the hormonal dysregulation. They don't understand how it impacts their bone health, their mental health, their gut microbiome in a very negative way. And they're never really full. So they're never really satiated. And it just creates this, in my experience, it really creates a very unhealthy relationship with food, because they desperately want to eat meat. That's why these plant-based burgers and things have come about. But I always say, if you have a desire to eat meat, just eat the meat. Don't make it complicated. But
yeah, they're making banana. I'm seeing that Sean Baker always posts stuff.
Hilarious.
Banana peel bacon, and they're doing like, it's all crazy stuff. And you look at how terrible. I mean, you look at the food, like if you look at Beyond Burger and dog food, you look at put the labels next to each other, and you're like, which one's which? You don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's all processed, terrible stuff. And I think that comes back to the gut microbiome being a disaster when you're putting these Franken foods in there.
Yeah.
And so it all takes a toll. So Troy,
No,
you got one question. What's your next one, man?
No. Well, I want to be very clear. I have plenty of vegetarian patients, and some of them are just straight up food preferences, right? Some of them have very ethical reasons. I find, just like you, many of them just thought that it was healthy and never really ate those foods, or had a general disdain because of fat phobia, and so many of them. So we respect everybody's food choices, but I'm with you that most of it is not the fact that they don't like it; they just were taught not to eat it.
Yeah.
So the next question is about hormones. You mentioned that you're very favorable on HRT, and I felt that, there's a lot of bias against hormonal therapy. I think the Women's Health Initiative, when it first came out, we know some of the flaws from that, really created a big scare, and even, away from kind of female health and male health, there's some big stigma about prescribing testosterone as if it's like, some illicit drug, right, for everybody. No, there's some people who need it, but can you give me a rough estimate of what you think, once somebody really conquers lifestyle, they support their body, with sleep, they support their diet, right? They have good people in their life, they supportive environment. Once they get the lifestyle in order, how many do you think still would benefit from hormonal treatment? How many do you find maybe wouldn't need it? Like what, I can tell you that I've seen, people lose a ton of weight and all of a sudden their testosterone goes from 100 to 700, right? So what do you think? Help me understand the dynamics and how you'd approach that.
Well, I think it's a twofold issue. It's interesting. I just interviewed Avram Bluming, and he's an MD that you're probably familiar with. He wrote a book called Estrogen Matters with Carol Tavris, and he unpacks a lot of the findings that were manipulated from Women's Health Initiative. And it's absolutely fascinating because I was finishing up my training at that time. And I remember everyone, including my mom and her sisters, were all taken off of HRT. I would say that most, if not all, so I would say 80 to 90% would benefit. And I'm talking about women that are in perimenopause and menopause. Like our bodies stop producing progesterone like it does in our, peak fertile years. Our eggs are as old as we are. The adrenals have to pick up the back end progesterone slack. Estrogen starts to be made from estrone. So this kind of weaker form of estrogen made in, unfortunately, adipose tissue. And testosterone, once you lose it, there's really not a lot of ways that we can improve that, at least for women. So I do find most women, when they really understand the physiology of the brain and how critically important estradiol and progesterone and testosterone signaling are, I think as they understand, they really struggle with maintaining or building muscle without that testosterone component. I think most women would benefit, even if it's just for the sleep piece. Progesterone alone is oftentimes what contributes to the initial issues of insomnia and early perimenopause, late 30s, early 40s. So I think even transdermal or oral progesterone therapy can be hugely impactful. But women are, again, in many ways, they are either shamed into considering they're shamed into not considering HRT, or they're so scared that they're going to take HRT and they're suddenly going to they're going to develop some particular form of cancer. I mean, these are and I'm kind of parroting and rephrasing some of the concerns that are articulated to me. So I would say most, if not all, would benefit, even if just from the perspective of a little bit of intravaginal estradiol, or just even some transdermal or oral progesterone therapy to help with sleep. But I think, that one of the staggering statistics that I think is worth sharing is that oftentimes it's not a question of if, but when. So a lot of the unfortunate side effects of menopause for a lot of women are related to the genitourinary. So dryness, painful sex, etc. It's not a question of if, but when. By age 60, it's 50% of women. By age 70, it's 90%. And that can be improved upon just by using intravaginal estradiol. So I think most women would benefit. I think they're just scared. They're scared to have the conversation, or they're given synthetic hormones, or they just don't know what they don't know. But A book that I read that I think your listeners would definitely appreciate is a book by Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who heads up the Alzheimer's Research Center at Cornell. And she wrote a book called XX Brain. I recommend it all the time, but I think for a lot of women who are scared, nervous, want to be better informed, that's a great starting point, as well as Estrogen Matters by Dr. Bluming and Tavris. Those are two books that I think are very pro women having the ability to make a choice for themselves, but also not done in a scary way. It's really done objectively, just trying to educate women to understand that there are options other than not choosing to do HRT, as one example.
Do you have a go-to that's your favorite of hormone replacement?
I like oral progesterone. So oral natural progesterone. Estradiol patches, I think, have been helpful. A lot of women want to start with intravaginal estradiol, and that's certainly a good starting point. But it's always in the context, like, what's a woman's, well, DEXA scans in and of themselves aren't particularly helpful, but we want to maintain bones, we want to maintain heart health, we want to maintain brain health. And so really thinking thoughtfully. I don't like a lot of oral estrogens because they get that massive first pass effect. And I just see far too many women that are kind of struggling with side effects. I do find that patches seem to do better. Some women even need testosterone, although I will usually kind of politely refer out for that because there's technically no FDA approved form of testosterone therapy. And there are definitely women, just like you were mentioning, Tro, there are definitely people that, whether it's a SNP or a genetic susceptibility, they just don't make a lot of testosterone. And so they may be in a position where, they don't have insulin resistance, they've dialed in on their stress. So, they may benefit from a little bit of testosterone therapy, but I think that's always in the context of looking at labs, being very clear, working with someone who's savvy with hormonal therapies so that they can make the best decisions or help you make the best decision or help you with choices. But progesterone to me is like the gateway. Like that's usually that, or if someone needs to have some thyroid medication, that's certainly an option. But I always say progesterone is usually an easy thing because it helps people with anxiety, sleep. And let me just say this again. Sleep is so critically important for women that once they start sleeping better, then they will make better food choices. Then they can, commit to fasting. Then they have more energy to want to exercise. And so I feel like that's a great starting point.
Yeah, and anxiety and stress and all those other things, they all go hand in hand. That's why we have to look at the big picture, because you could do as low carb as you want. You could do intermittent fasting, but if you're stressed and bitter and don't sleep and miserable, like for us, like you were talking about badge of honor, for us docs, it was a badge of honor saying, yeah, I've only slept 4 hours a night for the last 2 months, right? And we go, that's all I need. I could still be functional. But when you start realizing you're dysfunctional after sleep deprivation.
Yeah, I can't even, and I think we all trained at a time when you all still had these insane residency hours. Like I remember being at a
Tro was probably wimpy. It was my day when they changed all the rules. They got so Tro's crying, and he had the easy rules, man. We had the hard rules when I was there. We would go 3 days without sleeping and all that crazy stuff. Tro goes like 1 day and he's crying about it.
Yeah,
no, they do 100. I think it was like 100 hours a week or something like that. When I just started, they changed this up. So before that, it was like whatever, the wild, wild west, but they limited it to, basically.
Can you believe that? They limited it to 100 hours a week. That's limiting it to that compared to what, how crazy it was, but it just got passed down because we had to do it. You have to do it. So it was really good that they changed those rules because it's really, really hard on the anatomy.
No, and I can't even imagine because I always worked 12-hour shifts. And I remember if we did 3 nights in a row, you never knew which end you were up. And we used to be exquisitely sensitive, like, oh, this resident, this is like day 4. We don't want to call them unless we really have an emergency. But yeah, it's like one of the worst things you can do to your body is not get enough sleep. It's so restorative and foundational to our health. And I am crazy about my sleep. Like my whole family, I go to bed before my teenagers, which is both embarrassing and funny. Like my husband now has to stay up a little later. I'm like, you need to make sure they go to bed because if I'm not in bed by X time, I'm a wreck the next day.
Tro, you're not asking another question, man. I'm pausing.
I thought you guys froze. I'm like, are you guys there? I was like,
that's never happened that we all sat there and never said anything. But it's so important. And especially you, I see you getting out, you're doing the sauna, you're working out, you're doing stuff. You're like, it's motivational too. And coming from where you came from and realizing I think you're in a unique situation because you realize the effects of stress and pushing it too much, and even overworking out. That's a huge thing because people think, okay, I'm not losing weight, I got to step it up more, I got to work out more, I got to sleep less, I got to, and you start forcing the issue rather than saying, okay, let me relax a little bit. And I'm telling you, I have data on this with patients, Tro. It's hilarious, but I have a guy, he went on vacation, ate terrible stuff for a week, and he loses 8.8 pounds during this time. And I'm looking at his sugar trace and going, how in the heck, are you sure your scale's right? But it was electronic and we can see it. He goes, yeah, I feel really good. But he was away from his stressful job, his like 16-hour-a-day job. And, he got to relax and play games and laugh with people. And it plays a huge role. And I think that's something we've overlooked to an extent of, getting enough sleep and rest and being able to sleep in and not have the alarm wake you up, those kind of things.
Yeah. Well, I know during Christmas, we took a trip with our children and I was out in nature. So it was like, we really embraced it and there were no alarms set. There was, we kept the schedule very loose. And I told my husband, I was like, my mental health, just being connected to nature and not being on a strict schedule. Gosh, this is so nice. I need to do more of this. So I think more of us are realizing the net impact on, the concept of grind and hustle. Forget that. I don't think any of us need to be. If the last 2 years have taught us nothing, it's like, really getting fine-tuned, crystal clear about living our best lives and finding the resources that we need in order to be able to support that. Because I certainly don't want to go back to, when I think about doing CrossFit classes at 5:30 in the morning, and then I would shower at the gym and I'd go to the hospital and I'd be, stressed all day, making sure I was home to get my kids off the bus and, solo parenting. I'm like, I wouldn't go back to that in a heartbeat. I would love to be with my kids again at that age, because that's back when they were still smaller than me and sweet and not surly. Now they're both taller than me. But I wouldn't go back to that lifestyle at all, ever.
I don't think people understand how much that plays into the journey. Things like sleep, a study about 2 weeks ago showed that 1 hour more of sleep helped people decrease their sweet cravings, food cravings, and led to a 300 calorie reduction per day without them even knowing, right?
Yeah.
Decrease in stress. Stress actually makes you eat without the self-perception of hunger. You don't feel hungry from stress. You actually just feel anxious, right? Or you feel the stress, you don't feel hungry. So you don't have the self-perception of hunger. But then when you go to eat, you eat as if you're hungry. And what you eat more than what you normally would be all hyper-palatable food driven from that reward center of the brain.
Trying to spike the dopamine levels to make you feel better from the stress you're under all the time. And
I mean,
I'm saying, maybe I should be less stressed and I'm not have to count my calories. I get enough sleep and I'm eating the right foods. It's really getting out of that mindset of just counting your calories and saying, okay, I'm going to fit this mold right here. Some days you may need more calories, some days you may need less, right? Depending on what you're eating. But fasting, intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, all these things are beneficial. And I'm telling you, what's interesting about it? I'm looking at like Gundry. He's a guy who's been talking keto and low carb. He's talking about fasting. Anyone you talk to, I think it's really coming back into people looking at the data saying, really, I was kind of dumbfounded for a while. They're looking, going, what really matters? Is it mitochondrial health? Is it gut health? But if you look at it, they're both affected by the same things. It's the same treatment either way. So I don't care which one I get better. If I can get them both better at the same time, that's even better, right? But what they're saying is a lot of times that this intermittent fasting will make your mitochondria basically, believe it or not, less efficient, meaning it dumps out more energy. This uncoupling that Ben Bickman has been talking about, and a few of the other ones, Ludwig has been talking about it, is uncoupling that energy. So you're wasting more energy. So you're driving a gas guzzler rather than being very efficient and taking all the calories out of your food. So it's very, very interesting topic. And that intermittent fasting dials right into that. And it does help both the gut microbiome also. So yeah, I think you're definitely onto this. And I love everything you're doing. You've been an awesome friend to us and keeping us in line and like a sage advice and just really, really having the desire to learn and how do you help your patients better. And we've all been able to bounce things off each other. So it's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel very, very grateful. That's one thing that, whether or not your listeners are cognizant of, that this kind of low carb keto space of clinicians are so supportive of one another, and there's so much camaraderie and it's genuine. I always say that, it's sometimes when none of my clinician friends understand, I can come to you all and say, how would you address this? Because I'm really struggling, within my kind of more traditional allopathic minded colleagues that, they kind of go, oh, Cynthia's into that fasting thing. Like we don't really put a lot of credence, but I think all of us are helping to create a wave of change. I feel like with each year, I feel more hopeful that this will be the norm as opposed to being like a fringe concept on the side, because I think, we're starting to stand up. We're starting to, really speak out and share our stories. I think that I was reflecting on recently was, it was 3 years ago last month that I was in the hospital. And I remember thinking when I came out that I was no longer going to play small. Like, I think I've always been the people pleaser. I've been, that person who just kind of goes with the flow because I don't really want to make waves. And I feel like it's really vitally important that we speak out. We have a voice. We talk about this public health threat, really making sure that we're helping people inspire to live healthier, happier lives.
I don't think people, I got to be honest with you, if you look at our profession, I'm not sure that they care, right? We care about shaming people. We care about virtue signaling, right? But I'm not sure they really care about affecting people, right? Just take this thing and you'll be fine. That's
I think the awareness, I think when they see the benefit, I think it's like we all say, I think Professor Noakes and all these people say, you cannot see what you've seen. So once you see it and you experience, you say, well, it doesn't make sense. Anyone with common sense, when you say, okay, my patient has high sugars, I'm giving them 60% of their calories in sugar, and I'm giving them insulin to get rid of their sugar. So you say, well, if I don't give them the sugar, then I don't need to give them the insulin. Then I can cut back on how much. And when you think about it logically, it absolutely makes sense. That's why CGMs make so much sense to me. You see it and then you go, even if you have it on for a week, it just helps you to see, oh my goodness, when I'm having oatmeal with some brown sugar and banana, look at my sugars. If I have eggs, look at my sugars, right? So if you're diabetic, it's a no-brainer once you see it. So a lot of people, and what we're seeing is over time, people become more metabolically flexible, meaning the same thing they ate a year ago, if they eat the same thing in a year, it doesn't have the same effect. You don't see these huge sugar fluxes that stay up for, you'll see a much more quick descent of those sugars, right? And back to normal. So our body can handle it better. So you're right. And I think we're all saying the same thing is like, okay, if you're metabolically very sick, you got to work hard. It's going to be a harder struggle for you. And if you're metabolically healthy, you can get away with more stuff. That's just the way it is. It's just not fair, but that's the way it is. So, choices we made along life and I think, again, the big thing we're all talking about is the effect of stress, lifestyle, exercise, activity, downtime, that we always thought of it as, I mean, the caregivers always think of downtime as being lazy or they're not taking care of stuff they need to, but I'll tell you, it does pay dividends if you could just sit down for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and say, okay, I'm not going to deal with the kids or the Labradoodle making a mess or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Just having that little bit of time, whether it's your drive, whether it's sitting in the sauna, whatever you're going to do, collecting rocks, I don't care, wherever you find your peace, right? So, Tro, we have any questions from our Patreon supporters, or is it all comments about how great Cynthia is?
Basically all comments on how great she is. Oh, got a raised hand here. Okay, let's see. We got Bob Collins, a longtime supporter. So let's see, he's raised his hand. We'll let him ask a question. You're going to be put on the spot unless you did it by accident.
You got to unmute him, Tro.
Did you do that by accident, Bob?
I did. Sorry. I just meant to say how great Cynthia was and loved following her. She's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I think all of our people are going to say the same thing. She's great. Why don't you have her take over the podcast? You guys go do something else.
No, I get to enjoy all the great people that you all bring on board.
And tell everyone about your podcast and how they can find you and all that stuff too.
Yeah, so it's Everyday Wellness. I've been fortunate to have both of you on, not together. We'll have to make that happen in 2022. Everyday Wellness, and it's on iTunes. It's everywhere, and we're getting ready to have our 200th episode. So it's exciting that we're going to hit that milestone. But I'm probably easiest to kind of connect with on my website. So it's www.cynthiathurlow.com. I am snarky on Twitter, be forewarned. I am active on Instagram. I do have a private Facebook group that's free. It's called Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. Men and women are welcome to join that. But those are good places to find me. And obviously the book, you can connect with it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, or your local bookstore. And I'm exquisitely sensitive to the local book retailers because they have in particular really had a tough time the last several years. So if you're able to purchase locally at a local physical bookstore, definitely check into that option.
Awesome.
That's awesome. And if you're my patient, it'll be in my waiting room.
Oh, well, thank
You
you.
can check it out, and we'll have copies of it. So, because yeah, I think it's so important. It's such a huge topic, and I think dispelling all the myths and rumors and all that stuff, and having people like you who have clinical experience, I think that's
Mhm.
one of the things that's come to the forefront. Is like, let's listen to the doctors who are actually practicing and seeing what they're seeing, right? Because
Mhm.
we're not selling a product, especially with this intermittent fasting. You're not selling a product, right? They can get your book and learn and
Yeah.
for the rest of their lives for $26 or whatever it is going to
Yeah.
be, depending where they get it. But it's an investment in your health, and just trying to be just realizing the importance of balance. I think it took me a lot of years, 25 years or so, to figure it out. Running, and you're just so busy, you're on the treadmill that's too fast and you can't slow down. But being able to slow down, and now I can read your book on the weekends now and not be stressed out. It does make a difference. Like, if you're burned out and tired, you don't have time, you don't want to learn, you're just done.
Yeah.
So
No, it's a
young
hierarchy
kids
of
like
needs
Tro
in our
can do it.
bodies.
This has been great. Yeah, I'm getting killed, Brian. But yeah, absolutely. This has been an awesome interview, and we really, really appreciate you. Appreciate everything you do. I love your message on Instagram and Twitter. So I see the hate coming your way, and I know you're just like I get the hate. So, but you know what? Bring the fire.
I don't even know when I get hate, because I stopped looking, because you only see 20 nice comments and one jerk. I'm like, I don't want to mess up my cortisol levels. I'm not going to argue with you. You already have your mind made up. It's okay. Right?
No, my mindset is block and release. I'm like, that's how I deal with it. If I happen to see some kind of rude comment, I'm like, I don't even entertain the possibility. I'm not getting my blood pressure up. I'm not going to stress about it. There are always going to be trolls that are out there. I think, I think the most important thing is that we remain attuned to, sharing with high integrity, sharing the insights we're seeing, sharing the great success stories that we're seeing, because it's so important. We're helping to make a difference. And that, to me, allows me to sleep well at night.
Yeah, and we'll see. And we're actually crossing paths at Salt Lake, right? Keto Salt Lake. So I'm excited about that, because when you're there and you see people and you hear the stories, you think, oh my gosh, we're doing something. Like, the great stories we hear is so inspiring, and it makes us go back and be ready to do it again, right? We don't give up. So it's really cool, and I think, again, even talking about the struggles and where people are struggling, and then we put our minds together and say, why is this middle-aged female struggling so much? Is it hormonal? Is it this? And then we could figure out, is it sleep apnea? Is it something we've missed along the way? And that's what makes us better, because we learn, and when you learn from that one patient, you can help the next one along, right? And we can all help each other. And so your topic is so important, because there's so much misinformation. So I'm glad we got to address that and have you come on.
Yeah,
it was always good to see you anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a pleasure to connect with you both. And I love your podcast and recommend it often. In fact, I have a lot of my followers who are fan geeking over the fact that we're connecting today. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and ours too. And I think that's so cool that there's not competition. Go, hey, look, listen to this, and you're going to have different interests. You're going to like different styles. That's cool. Find what works for you. But ultimately, we're all saying the same message, where we share a common vibe, and we may not say it in the same way. We may have different language, like Tro. But I think really just trying to have the motivation to say, hey, let's help as many people as we can along the way. And we have fun doing it, and we get the rewards. And I think, Tro, like your comment about doctors being burned out and everything, I think once they see people feeling better and doing better and coming off meds, I think it's so inspiring. And these docs, generally will just leave the system and do it outside. That's what we're seeing, a trend of that, where people don't want to be a slave to the system. And so once they realize, hey, I can spend a little more time with my patients, I can enjoy it and have fun looking at labs and saying, look at your A1C or your insulin getting better, that you're not stressed anymore. Man, you seem calm, you look great. Those kind of things are fantastic, because that's the human side of medicine that we're missing out on.
Well, and it brings you back to what's most important. I think all of us, went into medicine because we have a strong desire and a love to help others. And so being able to kind of stoke that common theme and be able to do it in a way where you're not rushing from patient to patient, you're not dealing with an emergency one after another, allows you to really develop patient rapport. And that's everything.
And we lower our own cortisol and stress hormones, and be able to think and laugh and have fun and make fun of Tro. That makes me happy. Tro, you want to close this, man?
No, this is great, guys. Thank you so much. Let's all go to our clinics and go put our superhero capes on and stethoscopes around our neck and do the work that needs to be done. Cynthia, thank you so much. Brian, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and Patreon supporters, thank you for your support, for sticking with us and listening. I'm glad you got a little treat today, and we'll probably get this out a week from Monday, probably, I'm hoping.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's always a pleasure to connect.